So let's get started. Design systems in CSS variables. And the sub of this talk is to design two systems. A dive into why we don't use CSS frameworks. Now, this is something that I've been exploring for a little while. We needed to redo the entire theme on Level Up tutorials. And unfortunately, we had to start from scratch. So it meant that we get to rewrite a lot of the ideas that we had approached building our site with. So before I get into it too much, who am I? I am Scott Tolinski. I am the co-host of the Syntax Podcast. I do a twice weekly podcast I do with Wes Boss. And I'm also the creator of Level Up Tutorials, which is a tutorial streaming service. I started as a YouTube 20 and over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. We've been doing over 2,000 free tutorials on YouTube and a ton of paid premium tutorials on leveluptutorials.com. So this sort of mode of me talking into a microphone, into a camera, is sort of my default. So if we're being entirely honest, the online conf thing's pretty nice for me. I'm pretty used to it. So hopefully it'll be kind of relaxed and chill here. So brief history of leveluptutorials.com. It was originally built on Drupal using the Omega theme, and it was just sort of styled together with Omega. And it was eventually ported to Meteor.js sometime, I believe, 2014, it was ported to Meteor. And with Meteor, it was initially built on their front-end framework called Blaze, and then it was then rebuilt into React, where it now resides and has for a long time. And there's also two separate sites. There was a store.leveluptutorials and a leveluptutorials.com. And both of those sites existed as entirely separate entities, and they were eventually combined into one. So as you can see, this is a pretty standard life cycle of many projects, right? It changes and changes and changes and changes and changes. Next thing you know, you have piles of functionality added on top of piles of functionality. And like you would come to expect, the CSS was a total mess. It was absolute garbage. And I really pride myself in writing excellent CSS. That's like really the way I like to program, is via CSS. However, over time, it's sort of inevitable when a project undergoes that much of a change that the initial system it was built on is going to be just totally left in the dust. I'm sure many people have experienced something like that. So we did what any smart team would do, and we rebuilt it from scratch. And I say team pretty loosely. It's me and one other developer. So we had a lot of freedom. We get to make all of our choices. It was, prior to this, built on Stylus was the CSS preprocessor, also with Post CSS. And now we wanted to use styled components. So we had to think about what we wanted to do. And really, a lot of these things just kept pointing to the answer of CSS variables, because our audience did not need to support IE 11, which is, of course, the main bummer with CSS variables, is that they don't work on IE 11. That said, if the majority of your users aren't using IE 11, and I mean, like, when I say the majority, I mean 100% of our users are not using IE 11. Our audience is web developers, right? So we had total free reign to use CSS variables. So I got to learn a whole lot of lessons. So give you some introduction on CSS variables overall, and the sort of past, right, is we're probably used to, if you've used a CSS preprocessor in the past, I don't know, 8 years or so, you've probably seen one of these two syntaxes, or maybe less syntax. So the SAS syntax was $, your variable, colon, the value. Stylus, I actually really like Stylus because it had this transparent variable thing where you could override a variable. So that way you could define the keyword black on your site to just be black, right? It's just, it's the new value. Anytime you use the keyword black, it just would output your color. I loved this. It was one of my favorite features. And then sometime along, CSS variables were announced as being an actual thing. And we got a peek at the syntax. And what do we get? We get this. And I think most people, they saw this initially. And I say most people, I'm speaking for a lot of people that I don't intend to. You may very well look at this and been like, that's great. But I looked at this and I thought, well, what happened to all my transparent variables from Stylus, my nice variables from Sass? I'm going to miss that stuff. I don't want to use these CSS variables. What is this? And I initially didn't like it. And I'll talk a little bit of why I changed my mind really quickly after I started using them. But initially, I really just thought this was too verbose and didn't really, I don't know, it wasn't as clean and easy to read. But I soon came around. So this is the syntax. You have to define the scope of the variable itself. In this case, the :root scope just defines it as the root of your application, and then the variable name, and then the value. Then you can use the variable, but you have to use this var function, and then you preface this with these 2 hyphens. So here's some code pens for you. See this in action. Now, here's where CSS variables really start to take a turn into being the cool feature that I know and love them today as. We have our root scope defined as black. We have our H1 used as black. You can see this normal one here. And then the spicy version is getting a class of spicy. But notice how I'm not changing the color property here. I'm changing the CSS variable. And what this is doing is overriding the variable within the scope of this class. And this becomes a key property to what makes CSS variables so excellent. So this is obviously a very basic version, and obviously you would probably never do it just like this, because why wouldn't you just change the color? But check it out. This gets really cool here really quickly. So here we have the root defined as black once again. We have the H1 here as black, and we have the spicy div, but you'll notice this is pink. Well, why is it pink? Well, if we scroll down, you'll see here, I'm updating the variable within the body scope to be the black to be now magenta, which means that you can update CSS variables within a media query, which is just one of the most amazing properties of them. And check this out. When I adjust the media query, it changes, just any good media query does. But it's actually updating the variable, meaning that you can change a host of properties all on your site with one fell swoop just by changing one value rather than having to update 1,000 different classes. And this gets really super interesting the more and more involved you get in this. So the key point here is that these CSS variables, unlike our pre-processed variables, are reactive. They're fully reactive to real time in our application without us having to do anything, changing classes or whatever. So let's add a little JavaScript here, as the web is wont to do. And we have our background of var bg. We have the color of var bg. Actually, I don't know what happened here. This should be below this. Doesn't matter anyways, it still works. Let's paste this down here. There we go. So the root is defined as the BG text, or the BG is white. The text is 333, and therefore the the background is white and the color is text. Now with one simple class change, and this class is being added to the body, I should say. This is the body. All we're doing is updating the BG and the text. So if I click the toggle theme, just by simply adding a class, we've now created a dark mode. Hey, voila, that was the easiest dark mode ever. Now, granted, this is a pretty trite example, specifically because you're just changing 2 properties here. But you can imagine if your entire application used a series of these properties, whether it's BG, text, or whatever, then when you toggled the dark mode just by changing 2 values, you could get a dark mode working for the entire application in just about no time. And now I'm going to do, I don't know if this is necessarily a live demo here. Let me move some of the stuff over here. Okay, so I'm calling this the live demo, but it's, let's see, pop it over. This is the actual level up tutorials.com here. This is the actual site that's live right now. Let me pop up and make it full screen. There we go. Okay, so this is the actual site. So this is exactly how our design system works. And this is how our dark mode works. So if I head to my account And I just update the account here, you'll see that we have this dark and a whole site becomes themed. Now, our whole site gets themed based on several key variables. If you can hear dog barking right now, my dog is going nuts, so I apologize there. I don't know. She usually gets upset when packages arrive, so. Okay, so we have our light theme, and this is the standard theme for level up tutorials. Let me look at the actual CSS in the site. You can see here's a whole bunch of our CSS variables defined, just like this. Here's where they're all defined. And we start to get into it where we can say the background color is purple, the line color is white 60. Even more importantly, the sheet background is white. In this site, we use sheets, sort of like material design. So the thing is a sheet of paper. So that's a sheet of white paper. So it's initially white. We have a sheet hover color, a sheet text, and of course, a whole bunch, which is great. And we also have the card background for our cards. So what this means, and well, things like border radius and whatever, we'll get into the system more in a second. But what it means here is that we have these simple properties set based on colors, and that means we get to change the entire theme of the entire site with just this many lines of code. This is our entire dark mode for the entirety of Level Up tutorials. This is it right here. And it's just by changing several variables rather than having to deal with classes, individual things, whatever. We're just changing live variables. And all we're doing again is adding a class to the body, and that's overriding the root scope. And you can see it really makes it easy to add a whole ton of different themes. I mean, we have the OLED mode, we have the 90s theme, and we have the next level theme, and the Wave Race 64 theme. I also have a Wave Race 64 sunset theme, but it's not quite there yet. It's got a nice little sunset. It's one of my favorite parts. So we have this whole theming system set up, and this is just easy, changing one class. And the only JavaScript that we're doing here is adding and removing a class. We're not having to do JavaScript other than adding and removing a class, and it's updating the entire site. So here's the 90s theme where all of the colors have to be color names. So we got Rebecca purple and the teal and black. Next level is basically the same as OLED, but things are gray, no purple. So for people who don't like purple, and then the Wave Race 64, these colors are all taken directly off of the Wave Race 64 box art. So this is my favorite theme. I usually leave it on this, but sometimes it's nice to leave it on the default because that's how the majority of your users are using the application. Okay, so let's get back into it. We'll talk a little bit more about Level Up tutorials code in a little bit. So let's talk about the system here. The system. So how does the system work? How do design systems work? Well, really the whole point of a system is to let the code do all the work for you and not have to make decisions. I should be able to drop a card into a sheet and a paragraph and a header in that, and it's going to look good every single time because the system just exists, right? And the cool part about doing your entire system within CSS variables is that it makes it really easy to tweak, change, update on the fly, as you've seen. We all know, as developers, I should say, design is hard. I'm sure even as designers, design is hard. Design is a difficult skill, one that most people take their entire careers to learn and master. I am not a designer. I did, however, design this whole site. So whether or not I am a designer or not, I have to professionally wear that hat as a designer. And for the most part, it's a hobby that it's something that I've had to learn and pick up as I go. So as a developer, I needed to think inside of a system. So what does the system do? What is the system made of? Because it's really easy if you're a logical programming mind thinker to think, all right, I'm going to build the system and the system just takes care of it all. So your system contains colors, type, as in typography, spacing, characters. And what I mean by characters is sort of like the things that make your application, your site, your design unique, the things that make your application feel different than others, the way that my border radius is compared to yours, the way that my spacing and colors and fonts are. And the elevation, which is really just the system that we use. I took the word elevation from material design. We didn't take a ton from material design. I did take a couple things, elevation being one of them, as in the idea of something being away from the canvas should have shadows that react the way like a light source would. And there's also the idea of elements here. Now, elements are a little bit interesting. I like to think of elements as almost like HTML elements. These are like core pieces of chunks, structural chunks, like a card that don't exist in HTML, and they should have some predefined styles. So first and foremost, let's define colors. Too often people, I think, jump right into defining your colors intentions or actions, right? They say, here's our accent color, here's our this color, here's our that color. What I like to do is take all of the main colors that are going to be used throughout the site, but also just colors in general, such as pink, green, blues, those kind of things. And I would define them within our system's colors. Now, our colors were created for us by a designer in 2012, way back in the day, Mike McMillan, super talented designer. But I typically am not good at picking out color schemes. I would often go to a color hues or Cooler or one of the sites to grab a predefined color scheme. So I'm not inventing these color schemes, and I don't know if I recommend you do that either, unless of course you have an eye for color. It's a thing that takes quite a bit of training, right? So you're going to define your colors first and foremost, and then we're going to define the color's intentions. The reason why we don't just say the BG color is white is because, well, white outside of our application is FFFF, but inside of our application, it might be 1111, and that might be white. So I always define the colors first and foremost, and then take those colors and then repipe them into the intentions, i.e. like what they're used for. This way, if I wanted to change all of the way that the purple looks on the site, I just change the purple value. However, if I wanted to change the background color to gray, I can do that without adjusting any other purple value. So next is typography, right? Typography is hard. Notice how all this stuff is hard. Color's hard, type's hard, design's hard. It's all hard, right? But for this, I use a lot of these tools. Now, the one I like the most is typescale.com. Now, Typescale looks like this, and it allows you to select a ratio and a font and a base font size. I think our base font size on desktop is 18, and it spits you out this. Check it out. You can even grab the CSS directly from here, which we did. In fact, our CSS will look oddly familiar to this CSS right here. The cool thing about this is that it lets it so you have your whole heading system set up, and it gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 headings. We don't have 9 headings typically in HTML. And if you need more than 9 headings, which you might, maybe say you want a huge one, you click the plus button, or you click the plus button down here, and you can get even more. Now, our type system, we have, let's scroll up. Our type system has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It has 9 different headings. Now, the reason why is because I wanted to have 9 different font sizes on the site for headings, but we define them all as headings rather than H1, H2, H3, because sometimes something semantically has the ideas and feelings of an H1, as in it needs to be the biggest text on the screen semantically, structurally, for all sorts of accessibility reasons, but also just SEO reasons. For a lot of reasons, you want to write semantic HTML, right? But that always doesn't correlate one-to-one with the font size. And it's nice to, instead of having to reach into your pocket of M's, Rems, or whatever to say, oh yeah, this thing, that's the heading 1, or that's the extra big ass heading. So these are our different heading sizes. And this is largely how I do it. You'll also notice here the heading font and body font as well. That way we can, instead of referencing a font title of font something, you just, the body font, the header font, whatever. So that's our system. Try not to lose my slides here. Where'd they go? Where'd those slides go? It's all right. I lost them. No worries. They are a browser window, so that's cool. Okay. Let's see if I do Command F. Is that too full screen? No. Whatever. So here we have typography. Now, all of these links are good. These are all things I highly recommend. I also recommend checking out vertical rhythm. Now, vertical rhythm is an idea in which you're defining the space above and below your headings, your paragraphs, your fonts to make sure that that is all equivalent to your line height. So well, it turns out I didn't even need to show you my stuff, but here's it again in case you want to see. Now, for some minor exceptions here, I didn't show you this in our actual code, but the base font size is set here as being 1 rem. The base nav size is set to this. The small font size is set to this, and the smallest font size. Now, whenever those are used, we keep our heading to use the variables instead. I don't like to have the same value declared twice as a value here. But again, every system's different. That's one takeaway here. Okay. So, margins. Margins are tough, right? A lot of people use margins, and especially when they're first getting into HTML and CSS, they use margins and say, "This is what I need." Basis is out. Well, I use margins all the time myself, but if you don't know about collapsing margins and some of the pitfalls that they have, well, you could end up in a situation that looks something like this. Now, we all have this. We've all seen this. And this makes me sad is what this says. And here's what makes me sad about this. The body itself, actually, let's see if I can pop this open into its own window. That way I can inspect it. Do it live. Do it live. Okay, so this body, this is the padding on the body. But notice how there's so much more space above the top here. There's so much more space. That's weird, right? Well, why is that? Notice there's even a div container here. Well, if you aren't used to how collapsing margins and margins work in general in CSS, this might be one of the things that you dislike about CSS. If we look at this H1, you can see that this space is being created by the margin of the H1. And likewise, the margin of the paragraph tag extends beyond the container. Like, what's up with that? Why does that exist, right? Now, obviously, there are fixes for this. Actually, does overflow hidden fix this? Yes, it does. Overflow hidden fixes this, but do you want to throw overflow hidden on everything? I don't. So a good way to solve this issue is instead of dealing with margin tops, margin bottoms, is to then think about primarily as a padding value on the container itself, right? Let's say we did a padding of 1 rem, top and bottom. Now we get rid of our margin top, and this just works. So largely what we do is we use margin bottom only throughout this site. Now there are some caveats. There's always going to be caveats, but for the most part, we tend to always rely on flowing downwards of things to never have any situations where things get bumped up where you're not expecting them. So that's one of the reasons why we stick to margin bottom. Okay, so styled components, or by any other name, okay? And this is what I'm talking about with elements. Now, we use styled components in level up tutorials to define a card like this. That way we can just use our card, right? This is our card. In fact, if we want to see the card component itself, this is the card right here. Just gets the background of card BG, the border radius of border radius, the elevation of elevation, gets some padding, position relative, margin bottom, and saying that everything in here should not have a margin top. Well, the first child should never have a margin top. This is a nice little explicit line of CSS. So this is the card, right? And that way we can use this card as a thing, right? This is an element. But I highly recognize that not everybody uses styled components. And I would say by a long shot, not everybody uses styled components. So what do we have here? Well, we have BEM style. However, I just use a class of card. So you can use the system with anything that you're using, whether it is BEM, block element modifiers, I think that is, or styled components, CSS and JS, just straight up classes. Anything, what you're doing is defining the thing as it is as an element. You can imagine it being an HTML element. Along the same lines, what makes any of these elements good? Like, what makes an element better than another element? And largely that it's simple, it's obvious, hard to break, and extendable. As in, I can drop a card onto the page and it works. I can drop a header, I can drop a button, I can drop anything into there and it just works. Little bits of CSS like this margin top inside of a card, everything inside of a card. The first child of a, the immediate child of a margin, I'm sorry, the immediate child of a margin card isn't going to have a margin top. Little lines like this really save your butt. In addition, it can be extendable. For instance, we have these things called a line card. Now, the line card, I'm actually just noting some uh, somewhat redundant CSS. It could have been extended. So we could have taken this card and extended it. Now, I guess it was just slightly different, so we didn't do that. But they should be able to be extended. Like you should be able to have a dark card, a bright card, a line card, one that has no elevation, a modal card, all these things that should be living and breathing off of the same code that you can just take and extend. Hard to break. I already went over hard to break, and you can't put something in there that's going to make it look bad. Now, all of this stuff is obviously easier said than done, but through practice, you'll get there. So part of it is using systems in simplicity over configuration. And again, I'm going to show you some demo code here. Systems and simplicity over configuration means largely if you're looking at our these are some of our layout components. A lot of times when people write like elements and components within CSS, I'm referring to like a class as a component here. I'm using those words sort of interchangeably. What they do is they add a lot of options, right? A lot of modifiers if you're thinking in BEM, right? The block element modifiers, right? What is this thing? Well, it's this version, and there's these hundreds of different class names you can apply to this. Every single time you have to memorize one of those class names, or in a CSS and JS stance like props or something. Anytime you modify something with properties, the more options you give, in my opinion, the worse the thing becomes, because we have just a bunch of standard elements that do one very specific thing. For instance, we have a layout, which can either be tight, wide, or just normal. For a tight layout, it's stuck to 940 pixels. A wide layout will go up to 1280. Otherwise, it's always going to be 95%. We do not offer any other modifications to the layout other than this. Likewise, I mean, if we did, we would need to extend it into its own thing. It's no longer the layout. Sometimes, like I said, people want to add so much configuration. So we're adding simplicity here. Again, this is all CSS and JS stuff, but it's largely mostly CSS. And I'm sorry if some of the fact that this is CSS and JS gets in the way of what it is. You could think of this media large as just a straight up media query. Anytime you see a function like this, could just be an additional class added to this. So this is our columns component, and it's just using display grid gap of 50, and a grid template columns that's changed based on a property value, which can either be an array or a single value. And it's always going to, actually, I'm sorry, this is columns. So this is going to be always two columns. It's just going to be whether or not this is reversed or normal. So the whole thing is either going to be 1 fraction 65 or 65 1 fraction. Likewise, we have all of these components that are very basic, considering our flex component basically just adds a display of flex and zero margins, and it just gets things to our system, as well as our grid component, which you can see here. Our grid component is the one I was actually just starting to describe, where you pass like an array or a single string value, and it spits out some grid stuff. So these are just individual little layouts that are built explicitly for our specification, like explicitly for our specification. These things will probably not work too well in somebody else's design system, and they're not intended to be. I don't know what that was, but that's why these are not open source, because they're largely not going to help anybody. Sometimes people, when you have an open source framework or an open source library, it has to account for so many use cases that it ends up becoming much more complex than it needs to be. And if you design yours tightly to your own system, you get to take advantage of that system and simplicity over configuration. Make components that can't be goofed up. I've said this like 800 times now, but we shouldn't be able to drop something into a component and break it. So try when you make these components, if they're being put into the right spaces, the cards on the sheet, on the page or whatever, and something doesn't look right, then you need to evaluate why that doesn't look right. And usually the answer comes from simplifying things. So you don't need a grid system, at least not in 2020. Granted, Flexbox and Grid can't be on every single website due to browsers being that, that fun stuff. But if you have the opportunity and you have the ability to, CSS Grid is the absolute joy to use, can make your code so much more simple. I remember the days of the 960 grid system, and then we had the Bootstrap grid, and then we had Sass with Suzy, which was like one of my favorites, and then Stylus with I forget what Stylus had, but there was a whole bunch of these different grid systems, and they were always making your life so much easier by saying, all right, make this thing 1 column, 2 columns, whatever. We got CSS Grid now. You can just say, hey, here's a grid. It's going to be this many columns, and it can even adjust really nice and easily on this mobile layout. So use CSS Grid in absolute whenever possible, and obviously use Flexbox as well. By now, there is no reason why you shouldn't be using Flexbox on absolutely everything. I saw a new site design that I was working on the other day that was using floats, and it just like made me really upset because it didn't make me upset at the developers doing their job, right? But floats overcomplicate so many things, not to mention that they were never to be anyways in that sort of way. So having a tool like Flexbox in your toolkit, CSS Grid, will go a long way. And largely, a lot of the reasons why people even used a framework were to use a CSS Grid, right? So you might not need a framework. It's a bold statement coming from a non-designer. You might not need a non-design framework. Frameworks often give you overhead of KBs. You get that code added to your site that you're not even using. And you also have the onboarding here. Instead of learning the platform, right? Instead of being a better CSS developer and spending the time learning CSS, which is a core tool, you're spending the time learning the intricacies of, all right, I need to use this class now to deal with the negative margin thing that the Bootstrap grid added. And you have to learn those intricacies of these individual platforms. Because all of these platforms, while they're at the outset, they're there to be easy. The moment you need to start doing anything different with them, it gets into specific knowledge territory. And specific knowledge territory is only a good thing if it's going to make your life easier over the course of a long period of time. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't touched Bootstrap in a long time. And even when I did, each time I picked up Bootstrap or Foundation, it was a new version or slightly different, or built in Sass this time, or built in less this other time, or whatever. And I had to go learn something new. It wasn't like I could reuse all of that functionality over and over again. I always had to learn something new about it anyways, where you could always just pick up CSS and get good at it. So write only what you need in your system, because if you have all that extra fluff, what's it doing in your library? It's taking up space. It's just sitting there. It's taking up brain space. And it's there to potentially complicate your system. Use variables as the backbone as your system. If you use variables as the backbone of your system for type and everything like that, you can make large sweeping changes to your site and see them play out visually in front of you in one fell swoop. And this is different from CSS. This is different from like a post-processor or pre-processor variable, specifically because, let me pop and level up tutorials one more time, because part of what makes these things cool about them being reactive in this sort of way is that we can modify them within our dev tools in a really nice and easy way. In fact, I think if you just scroll down, you can see our overrides. Like, let's say I'm tweaking the site design and I want to see how this whole thing, how the entire site would look if the, let's do something different other than colors. Let's say I wanted the entire site to be a monofont. We could do hyphen header, is it text? Oh boy, I don't know header font, heading font. This is my fault for not naming these appropriately. Let's say I wanted to change the heading font of the entire site to something mono. I'm using Mono Lisa right now, Lisa. And look, not only did I change one heading, whatever, I've now been able to see the entire site update in live refreshable and removable anything. And here we go. Look at that. Every single thing that was a heading before is now Mono Lisa. Now, granted, the spacing still needs tweaking or whatever, but it works throughout the entire site by changing one value. Look at that. Look at that. You can even experiment with some fancy new color schemes. So again, this is just when you have variables as the backbone for your system, it's really easy to make large sweeping changes for your system. And when you're able to make large sweeping changes to your system, you're able to update, modify, fix, improve without jeopardizing the stability of your system, because you're not having to go into each individual property, do a find and release and change and whatever. So always use variables for any color, typography, spacing. And again, your site will be updated in one fell swoop. Hey, I said that and I wrote that too. I didn't even realize I had written that exact language there. You don't have to worry about creating unique custom components if they're all using custom properties. So when might you need to use a framework? There are situations where you might need to use a framework, and that's largely if you need to get it done really quickly. This type of system is not really suited for working super fast, unless, of course, you have your own system, which goes back to that XKCD joke about, you know, I'm going to create a new platform to solve this problem, and now there's another competing solution to the problems, whatever. So either way, if it needs to be done quickly, these kind of things are not suitable because it's not a fast solution. But once you have your system in place, let me tell you, it could not be any easier to add a brand new component to leveluptutorials.com right now, because we don't have anything to get in the way. We don't have to make any decisions. Just drop that thing in there and it works. If you'd like to do any additional reading on this, designsystems.com is created by Figma, which is my design application of choice. And actually, we created the entire design system within Figma before even taking it into code. Check out designsystems.com. Really, really great resource for learning more about these things. Design systems are a large body of reading overall, but once you get the basics as developers, it's really easy to think in these kind of systems and replace any sort of decision fatigue you might get. Again, a word on the Internet Explorer. It's a huge mega bummer that IE does not support CSS Variables in IE 11 because the fallbacks aren't super good. There are some fallbacks. I don't necessarily know if I would recommend them. That's why I don't have anything linked here. At least at the time of here. I don't love the fallback system for CSS properties because largely what it involves is coding the same color value twice. What I mean is that if you had a situation like this, background var card BG, you would have to say, all right, this is also white like this. White like this, because if the browser comes across this line, it wouldn't understand it, but it would understand this one, so therefore it would just default to having the background be white. That's certainly a possibility, but I never like having that double property declaration. It just feels icky to me. Not a huge fan. So thank you. I think that's all I have for now. I'm going to put on my headphones in case I need to hear anything. I don't want to get any feedback. Check out syntax.fm as well as leveluptutorials.com. We just released a course on design systems, but they're design systems within Figma, not specifically within code. We only primarily keep it to Figma. And syntax.fm, twice weekly.